Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 8 this time after we left off at the end of verse 9 last time, after the people demand of Samuel to have Yahweh give them a king. And before we continue into the description of the mishpat hammalek, the justice of the king that Samuel reported to the people, I think it might be helpful to pause just for another minute to consider the dynamics of what's going on here, because it's incredibly complicated, both in this scene and with what follows. So you see on the right side of the screen three questions here. Why do the people want a king? Why does Samuel become a kingmaker? And why does Yahweh accept the people's desire for a monarchy? I can't purport to answer it just out of this passage, and as you see on the screen, I provide a variety of the different perspectives, both in the scene that we just saw and the one we're going to look at today at the end of chapter 8, and then what follows. So some of this we'll just have to continue to see as we continue through the text. But a few things to pay attention to as we move into verses 10 and follows. And I have the screen, as you can see on the left side, moved up back to a little bit to where we looked before, so we can see some of the continuity between what we saw and where we're going today. So one thing to start with is there are three different verbs between the people and Samuel and Yahweh about getting a king. So let's note some of those differences. Back in verse 5, when they first asked, the New RSV has a point, but as we saw last time, Sema here, the Hebrew means set for us a king. But when Samuel heard it, he hears give us a king, which is a different thing than set us. Set us to put it into position and give us as if he's providing something they otherwise would not get. But now we see down in verse 10, Samuel reported all the words of Yahweh to the people who were asking him for a king. And what we saw, as you can still see back in verse 5 and verse 6, whether it's appoint or give, it's an imperative, it's a demand, it's not a request at all. But Samuel reports it to Yahweh as if it's a request, and that allows the writer, of course, to have a wordplay here that we lose in English, which is they're sawing for a king, or technically shawling. But you can see in my note down below, in the Hebrew italicized, it's basically saul. To ask is to saul, and we'll see it again later. So in other words, they're sawing for a king, and they get ask as a king, as opposed to David, which means beloved, as we'll see later. So the three verbs to look at that as we start. But as you can also see on the screen what we looked at last time in verse 7, Yahweh says to Samuel, it's not you they've rejected, but me they've rejected from being king over them. But we saw in verse 6, as you can see, it displeased Samuel. So what was Samuel so upset about? Is he upset on behalf of Yahweh? Is he upset because the people are selling out? Is he upset because he's losing power? So I want to keep those questions in mind as we continue through the rest of this chapter, and we'll see that play out more in the relation between Samuel and Saul later. Another issue that we have to pay attention to as we move into this next section is how do we read this condemnation of kingship, or at least a strong warning that it's not going to be a good trade-off to get a king in exchange for what, as we'll see, a king will demand, over against both Yahweh's approval that we see here, the anointing of Saul as king, the withdrawal of Yahweh's approval of Saul as a king. We'll see specifically in terms of Yahweh regretted that he had made Saul king. And then the making of David king, and Nathan's proclamation that Yahweh not only approves of David as being king, but promises a king on that throne forever. As if this little experiment in monarchy, which Yahweh would think would fail based on the warning that's being given here, would come to a crashing halt. Instead, it is approved of as an eternal institution. So how do we put all those pieces together? Scholars are divided in two basic courses, and we're going to look just briefly at the approach of three, and really just a topic line. One is to say, well, there's multiple different sources, and we've already seen that in my looking at this with you here, in the first 7 chapters, certainly it suggests it's an exilic reflection after the fact on how monarchy was the problem. But what we have here in these chapters is not quite as clear, because it has Yahweh's approval, and it's moving into the Samuel-Saul relationship that will continue later. So that leads scholars to ask, where is this negative anti-monarchy thing coming from? And what happens if we read it as ordinary readers do, and as people have done all the way through history until the advent of modern historical criticism of the Bible, as it continuous unit that seems to have so many internal inconsistencies to it. So just to show that how this remains a difficult question, probably 2,000 or 3,000 years after the text, depending upon when you think different parts are written, let's just look briefly. So Mark Luchter, who's a wonderful scholar of Hebrew Bible and has written a number of books and articles on these things, in 2006, this piece that I'm just showing you the highlighted piece from highlights, speaking of 1 Samuel 8 in particular, he says, the text stylistic features identify it as a 7th to 6th century composition. And then you can see farther down in that highlighted section, he says, it reflects Israel's experience with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is to say he sees it as a composition after the effect of the Assyrian destruction of Israel in 722 and the consolidation of the people into the Josiah kingdom in Judah and what may follow after that. So he sees this as coming out of that experience of Neo-Assyrian Empire. On the other hand, Jonathan Kaplan, acknowledging Luchter's piece, and as you can see writing this in 2012 in the Journal of Biblical Literature, argues that it has origins, as you can see there in the italicized part, in much broader ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern social, religious, and political practices of constraining the excesses of monarchic power. And he highlights it, the example of this, of the Babylonian, I won't use the German here, but the English mirror for princes. And you can see the example I provide on the screen here from his article of how he's comparing that with what we see in 1 Samuel 8. So that would be probably a century later, or at least half a century after Luchter's proposal. Another Jonathan Walton here gives up altogether, or at least chooses, I shouldn't say gives up necessarily, chooses a different reading, as you can see there in the highlighted sentence. The present analysis will be directed toward offering a coherent interpretation of the final redacted form. Which is to say, how do you read it consistently throughout without saying the opposing views are from different sources? And Walton has to work really hard to do that, and we'll look at a couple of things he has to say about that, but mostly he will argue that views that separate in different sources don't take account of how the whole thing fits together. So I'm not siding with one of those or another. I'm just suggesting as readers, we can't afford not to pay some attention to the fact that there are inconsistencies both in the characterization here, and I'm sorry, the different characters, Samuel, Yahweh, and the people, and for that matter, the narrator, and for that matter, the Deuteronomistic historian behind the narrator and behind the text, versus what we're going to see in the chapters that follow. So I'm also just going to put a blank box here on the right side because I want to use that space to show you a number of the ways that what Samuel warns them about will be echoed into passages that we're going to see as we continue through the history there. So Samuel, starting in verse 10, Samuel reported all the words of Yahweh to the people who were asking for a king. And one of the first questions scholars have to ask is, do we trust that? We saw in the last verse that Yahweh said, listen to their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them, this says the ways of the king, but the mishpat hammalek, which is what he says again. But we don't hear Yahweh name it. All we hear is Samuel say this, and as you can see in verse 11, when he says, these will be the ways of the king, or the mishpat hammalek, he doesn't say that Yahweh said that. So there's a real break here in the question of between the narrator's reporting that Samuel reported all the words of Yahweh and what's actually reported to the people who are sawing for a king. So he says here, and we see in my notes here, the king is being compared to the priest with the notation the king will be far more expensive to support, as we'll see. So he says, these will be the mishpat hammalek of the king who will reign over you. And already we're hearing that it's going to be not just reigning with you or for you, but over you, that this will be a hierarchical relationship. And as you can see, if I scroll down on the screen, and you can see the red highlighted thing, one key verb fills in this whole thing. Take, 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 take. 6 times here, king will take. And so let's look at that in detail to see what the justice of the king will be like. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. Appoint here is the same word that the people had asked for. So if Samuel will appoint a king for them, the king will appoint their children, their sons, to run before his chariots. And that echoes in advance, or echoes in the past, the Egyptian chariots that we see here in Exodus 14:9. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers, and his army. And it will echo again into Solomon in 1 Kings 4:26, as we see here. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. So whether looking back to Pharaoh or looking forward to Solomon, which when we finally get to the Solomon thing, may be actually telling the same story in two different ways, and if that's a teaser, that's okay, we'll get to it eventually, the relation between Pharaoh and Solomon, and whether Solomon might actually be an Egyptian plant, but we'll have to wait till we get there, unless you jump ahead when I finish these, and you can go first to 1 Kings 3 and play that out for yourself. But while I'm making this, I haven't gotten to that one yet. So appoint them to his chariots and to run before his chariots, which we can hear in Absalom's calling for them running before the chariots, his men running before the chariots in 2 Samuel 15, or Adonijah running before the chariots in 1 Kings when he tries to be the successor to David. So you probably wouldn't want to be people running before the chariots. And that echoes strangely here into the 50s piece that you see in the next verse, where you see that Adonijah has 50 men who run ahead of him, as does Absalom. That's not what's named here. The number 50 is not listed in terms of how many will run before the chariots. But note what running before the chariots means. That means standing out there in front of the armed horsemen and being the first to face the enemy. So your sons will be at the front of the battle. Then he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of commanders of 50s. Again, we hear that echoed a number of times. We see Saul here in 1 Samuel 22:7 said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, you Benjaminites," which is to say his ancestral people, where he came from, "will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds?" So Saul's saying that there as if that's a benefit, that David would be raising up their children into important military posts. But in the warning here in 1 Samuel 8, it sounds more like a sentence rather than a reward. And we'll hear it again that David does that in 2 Samuel 18. We see David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. So both in Saul's and David's there it has hundreds, whereas the text here has 50s, but the point is obviously the same. And in addition to appointing them for his military that we've seen so far, it goes beyond that. Some to plow his ground and reap his harvest. So the king will access your people for his agricultural expenses that will, of course, finance the military itself, along with tribute, which is not laid out here, but we'll see later in other texts. So to plow his ground, a rare word used here, as you can see in the note below, and to reap his harvest, a more standard word there, although in Deuteronomistic history, it's not that common. To make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. The same word here in Hebrew for implements and equipment, kele, simply generically like vessels. And you can see from my note, I won't bring it up on the screen, that matches from Judges 18, where we hear both of those, and then in 2 Samuel 1:27, where we'll see that again, where vessels of war are being used. So they will be, his sons will be doing all these things. Now we turn to the daughters. And the daughters, of course, in a classic gender division of labor, they're doing quote-unquote women's things, perfumers, cooks, and bakers. Perfumes is a rare word here, and it's an oddly specific thing to name for what your daughters will do, as opposed to the men leading the wars and harvesting the crops and developing the implements of war. Perfumers seems oddly specific. It's a rare word, as you can see. Cooks and bakers, obviously everyday work, and that's what he would take your daughters to be doing. And then further, he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. Note that this is saying that these people have fields and vineyards and olive orchards. The fields to be growing annual crops like wheat and barley, and of course the vineyards and olive orchards, staples, crops that involve investment of labor over time. Vineyards and olive trees obviously being long-term investments. So this is spoken to people who have all the things they need. We'll see much later that the image of being under your vine and fig tree is a classic Hebrew Bible expression of people living in abundance, much like a chicken in every pot in the early 20th century, expressing American middle-class sufficiency. So taking the best of your fields here, we'll see another echo of that in a minute, but one that we can see here is later in Kings, 1 Kings 22, where King Ahab of Israel says to the landowner Naboth, "Give me your vineyard so I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house. I will give you a better vineyard for it." But of course, if you know that story, he demands demands it and demands Naboth's life as well. So taking the best of your fields and vineyards and giving him to his courtiers here, but courtiers is dressing it up too much. Literally, it's his slaves or servants. So the suggestion isn't that it's giving to them because they get to keep it. It's a reward for them, but they will get to serve it. He will, in other words, the king's servants will use your fields to provide the agriculture for his own harvest. And again, we'll see that in Solomon described in detail. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers. And again, it says courtiers here, but officers expresses more that sense of that saris here, or eunuchs is literally, but it can mean people who work directly for the king. 1/10 is classically the tithe, and you can see various places. A classic place from Leviticus 6:20 you can see here. This is the offering that Aaron and his son shall offer to Yahweh on the day when he is anointed, 1/10 of an ephah of choice flour as a regular offering. So the offering that is intended to go to Yahweh, the king will take for himself. And not only of the choice flour, of the grain, but also of the grapes, and give it to them. And I'll scroll down so we can see the rest of the scene here. And he will continue by taking your male and female slaves. And a curious thing about it is to say that the Israelites have slaves, contrasting with the king's courtiers or slaves. So it's the same, it's not quite the same word here. It's an unusual word, abdekem here, but related to the same idea of having people under your control. So he will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys. Note that the Septuagint has that, Masoretic text has your young men. So the New Revised Standard here is following the Greek translation. Your best of your cattle and donkeys, and put them to his work. So again, the word is only here and one more time in 1 Samuel later, although I'm not showing you that because it's not directly relevant. Then he will take 1/10 of your flocks. The word for flock here, and so on, refers specifically to sheep or goats. So we see the cattle above could be oxen or cows, and the donkeys are now going down in size to sheep and goats. A very common word, but first here in 1 Samuel, and we'll see it especially in 15:14. I won't show you that now. We'll get there when we get there. And on that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but Yahweh will not answer you on that day. And that's a cold ending to this, as we can see, that the people will regret it, but it will be too late at that point. A couple details about this verse. The phrase on that day, Bayom Hahu here, Luchter argues that this reinforces the idea that it's a Josianic composition because it's used often there, but it is also used over 200 times throughout the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible. So one could argue with that one. The term for crying out here is the classic term for crying out, and it's especially the classic term that we see here in Exodus 2:23 that initiates the Exodus, the crying out against Pharaoh. In other words, the people will experience their king as their ancestors have experienced Pharaoh. Not a positive outcome. A king like the nations will be a king like the nations, oppressing the people in the ways that we see here. The Yahweh will not answer here has a couple of ironic echoes, as you can see here from 1 Samuel 14:37. When Saul is not sure what to do, we see Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him on that day. And the irony is, of course, that what we're seeing on the screen in front of us in 1 Samuel 8:18 is that people will cry out to Yahweh against their king, and Yahweh will not answer their cries about how their king is oppressing them, but won't answer the king either. And that's reinforced near the end of the Saul story, as we see here in 1 Samuel 28. When Saul inquired of Yahweh, Yahweh did not answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. So Saul is shut out from listening to Yahweh, and so much for their king being the one who Yahweh has appointed. And we'll get to that as we go. So as we finish our section here, and then I want to do another comparison. We see, having heard all that, the people are completely undeterred. And as we see from Haberstal and Holmes here, at the heart of politics lies an existential urge for physical security, and the people prove willing and even eager to relinquish whatever unsupervised freedom and entitlements they enjoyed in a state of divine anarchy. That battle for national security, that fear that leads to the cry for national security will pay any price, and one could certainly analogize to a U.S. Military budget that is the equivalent of the next 20 countries put together. If we cut it in half, would we feel unsafe? Can we even consider the price that we pay for national security, not just in dollars, but in other limitations on our freedom? you can discuss that in your small groups if you have them and you're following this, or in your parish or wherever else you're putting some of this to use. So the people refused to listen. The word here, munen, really, it's hard to pronounce without a vowel, literally means to refuse to obey commands. It's 41 times in the Masoretic text, as you can see, and we'll see it a couple more times later on. The people refused to obey commands, but the irony is, of course, they're refusing to listen to the voice of Samuel, not to be saying the voice of Yahweh here. A mistake in my note there that makes that hard to see, but it's not only not Yahweh they're not listening to, but they're refusing to listen to the voice of Samuel. And this is a little over-translated here in this "we are determined to have a king," as you can see from a couple other translations, like the New American Standard has "there shall be a king over us," or the King James says "we will have a king over us." It literally simply means that we are determined to have as a greater more translation than the Hebrew really supports. And so our section comes to an almost end here. As they finish speaking their sentence, so that we may be like other nations, and again, this is echoing their original call in verse 5, but it changes a little bit here, that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. So earlier they said we want to have a king like other nations, but now they expand that to say we want to be like other nations. So it's not just as Walton wants to argue in his article that I showed you earlier, a king like the nations is a particular kind of king, and one can make that argument, and he makes it well. But this seems to me that it expands the initial request. We want to be like other nations. In other words, they're abandoning their special relationship with Yahweh to be a special people called to be a witness to others by a way of life that is different than the nations. They've given it up. The threat of external enemies is more than they can handle, and they're determined just to blend in with everybody else. And that's named here in two strange ways, that our king may judge us, not rule over us, but may judge us. Perhaps they're denying the reality that Samuel has said, the king who will rule over us, and go out before us and fight our battles. And to go out and to come in is the classic description of leading in battle. And we'll see that David does that, as you can see below in 18:13, and doesn't do it faithfully in 2 Samuel 11, which is the Uriah-Bathsheba story. So it concludes with another strange little piece where Samuel returns to Yahweh. When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of Yahweh. So in many ways, as you can see, this frames with verse 10. Let me just go back to that so you can see there. So Samuel reported all the words of Yahweh to the people, and now we see here Samuel heard the words of the people and repeated them in the ears of Yahweh, as if Yahweh can't hear the people. It's one thing to say the people can't hear Yahweh, either Yahweh isn't speaking to them or they don't know how to listen. But Samuel is positioning himself as an intermediary in a way that maybe is not necessary. If the earlier chapters are about Yahweh alone, it wasn't Yahweh alone, but only through Samuel. And this is what leads us, and we'll continue to see this in the Saul's episodes, that Samuel has a bit of his own agenda, perhaps masquerading as Yahweh's agenda, as he continues to stay on the scene, even after he anoints Saul to be king very soon. So in the metaphorical ears of Yahweh, the only time we hear of ears of Yahweh, we hear the hand of Yahweh and the arm of Yahweh many times, the only time we hear of Yahweh's ears. So finally, Yahweh says to Samuel, listen to their voice. So going back up a couple verses, we hear so the people refuse to listen to the voice of Samuel, but Yahweh says, you, Samuel, listen to their voice and set a king over them. And ironically, earlier when it said appoint, the word meant set. Now the NORSV has set when the word means rule. The verb here to rule, to listen to their voice, and it's hard to translate, and put a ruler over a ruling king. I can't even find a way to say that in English over them. So Samuel said to the people of Israel, each of you return home. So before we end this today, I know it's a little bit of a long recording, I want to highlight another reflection on this from a different place. So this is the passage we just looked at on the left from 1 Samuel 8, 11, and 19, and then Genesis 47, 14 to 21. And this is near the end of the Joseph story, after Joseph has reconciled with his brothers, and they realize he's not going to kill them. And the story seems over, and then there's this story, which I won't read to you now, but I just want to highlight some of the parallels, and maybe you'd like to read it on your own. And I can't put it all on the screen without making it too small, and so you can see the color coding. But I want to highlight 3 parallels. So we saw here that Samuel warns the people that the king will take the best of your fields and vineyards, and we see down here Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. We see the warning he will take the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work, and we see that Joseph demands their livestock and gave them food in exchange for their horses, flocks, herds, and donkeys. And then we saw that you shall be the king's slaves, and the people confess that they are slaves, and they made slaves out of them. And so although the story in 1 Samuel is motivated by the fear of an external enemy, and the story in Genesis 47 is motivated by the fear of famine, either way, putting power in the hands of the king means that people become slaves. And we'll see how this deal plays out step by step, beginning with the finding of Saul next time. See you then. Bye-bye.